Hello and welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to a new episode of Africa Today, where we get you the latest news and events taking place on the African scene. And we will start off with our major top stories and reports. The Environment Ministry and envoy for the 27th UN Climate Change Conference, COP27, reiterated to the world that Africa bears the brunt of the climate change crisis, despite accounting for a tiny fraction of global greenhouse emissions. This came at a meeting of African Minister of Environment conference in Senegal. More in the following report.
The Environment Ministry, in a speech at the 18th session of the African Ministers of Environment Conference AMCEN in the Senegalese capital Dakar, said Africa accounts for 4% of global greenhouse gas emissions but suffers the most. Yasmin Fuad noted that 20% of the continent's population live in countries that are in the top 10 most vulnerable to climate change. Fuad said 172.3 million Africans were affected by drought and 43 million were affected by floods between 2010 and 2022. She said African countries are the most affected by food insecurity and water scarcity. She also said climate change is expected to push an additional 78 million people to chronic hunger by 2050, more than half of them in sub-Saharan Africa. She said adaptation is the top priority for Africa and Egypt. Egypt is set to host the COP27 in the city of Sharm el-Sheikh from the 6th to the 18th of November. Cairo has vowed to address African interests in combating climate change at the conference in Sharm el-Sheikh.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, and we're glad to be joined over the phone by Dr. Khaled Abu Zeid, the Regional Water Director. Good afternoon, sir.
Hi, good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Dr. Khaled. Sir, well, as the Conference of Environment Ministers convenes in Senegal, how do you see the importance of joining efforts to combat climate change in Africa?
Well, this meeting is just less than 2 months away from the COP27 climate change conference of parties, which will be held in Sharm el-Sheikh in November. And it is one of the preparatory activities at the African continent, which will come up with some recommendations and key messages that will be brought forward to COP27. As we all know, there is this African Ministers' Council on Environment, and they meet regularly. There is experts meeting that are held before the ministerial meeting, and ministerial meetings come up with important decisions that the African continent should bring forward and implement.
Yes. Sir, why is Africa the most affected region with climate change despite contributing least to the phenomena?
Well, as we all know, the climate change impacts are affecting several sectors, the water sector, the agriculture sector. It is also impacted by the energy sector and emissions, and also it has to do with other human activities such as transportation and other things. And the African continent is the least among the several other continents and regions in emissions, which are the main cause of climate change.
Yes.
The industrial countries, more advanced industrial countries, and the other continents actually contribute to those emissions much more than Africa. This is what causes global warming and climate change. And on the other hand, also Africa is, with its forests and green cover, is acting as the sequestration sink for carbon, which absorbs carbon and emissions from the atmosphere.
Yeah.
So it is also contributing to the mitigation measures that are to be taken by the world. We see also the impacts of climate change in Africa in terms of droughts in several regions, in flash floods, on the other hand, that damages a lot of the properties in Africa. These droughts, when they happen also, they affect agriculture production and food security. So Africa is hard hit and is one of the continents that find difficulties in adapting to climate change impacts. And it costs a lot, of course, for the communities in Africa to put the adaptation plans in place.
Yes. Well, sir, how is it that Africa has the lowest emissions reported at 4%?
Yes, of course. As I mentioned, that the industrial development, which is the main cause for emissions, especially if they are using non-renewable energy and if they are using energy sources that emit a lot of carbon, and these are the main cause of global warming. But in Africa, it's still developing. Many of the countries are still developing. They are advanced, of course, but they are advancing and developing, but they are not to that level of large industries that are the cause of all these emissions. There are also renewable sources in Africa, such as solar energy, wind energy, and the emerging markets of this new renewable energy is starting to develop in Africa, and hopefully the new developments and the new industrial era will be depending more on renewables, which will hopefully cause less emissions.
Yes.
All over the world.
Sir, how can Africa provide finances to deal with the surging impacts of climate change, in your opinion?
Of course, financing the climate and green finance is one of the main issues that are to be discussed, whether at the African Ministers' Council on Environment, the AMSEN meetings in Senegal, or even at COP27. And new methods of financing, innovative ways of financing, the role of the private sector, the national banks, the development banks, the private sector investment part also. All this will play an important role in shaping the financial agenda and the source for new finances into the climate and green finance market.
Sir, how can the developed nations be committed to support badly affected African nations, since they are the main contributors to climate change?
Well, of course, putting some financial resources and funding in the global funding mechanisms to support the other countries in the world to mitigate and to adapt to these climate change impacts is very important. As you mentioned, many of these countries are the main emitters of carbon and main cause of global warming and climate change. So it is important, of course, to contribute to national and global funding mechanisms for adaptation, mainly, which is needed by many of the countries.
Yes. Sir, how would you comment on the move to apply the Decent Life Initiative for a climate-resilient Africa in cooperation with the UN Development Programme to enhance adaptive capacities for rural communities?
Yes, of course. The role of all stakeholders is very important, whether it's UN organizations, regional and international organizations, NGOs, governments. They all need to put their hands together to find a way to implement adaptation mechanisms and projects to build resilient communities that can withstand those new climate change impacts that are hitting many places in the world. So it's very important for all these stakeholders to get together. The UN organizations can play a very important role in implementing models for adaptation projects, mitigation projects that could be replicated afterwards. So if the seed money is put in model projects for adaptation and mitigation, then these could be replicated by the communities and by the governments, and there will be some incentives for them to see first so that they can replicate.
How would you elaborate on the mechanism of enhancing adaptive capacities of rural communities?
Yes, of course. I mean, the rural communities also have a role to play, and they are hard hit by the impacts, especially with their poor capacity to adapt to the changes that are made. So it is important to pay attention to the rural economies, rural communities, and also to put some effort in making use of their mechanisms. Sometimes the rural communities have mechanisms for adaptation that are possible within their communities, and that could be an example for other rural communities. They come with indigenous solutions and nature-based solutions that can help a lot in facing climate change impacts, and we have to make use of these examples and share this knowledge with other communities around the world.
Dr. Khaled, another initiative introduced by the Ministry of Environment is dubbed African Women's Adaptation Initiative. What steps do you expect to be taken in this regard?
Yes, of course. I mean, there is several initiatives also that the Ministry of Environment and Egypt will present during COP27 in the water sector, in the agriculture sector, in the transportation sector, in the energy sector, in the waste management sector, biodiversity. Several areas and several initiatives will be launched during COP27, and several international and regional organizations and governments are committing themselves to join these initiatives that will be launched. And I think that this will be very important in the climate action that need to be taken after COP27 and moving forward.
Yes. Well, I would like to thank you very much, Dr. Khaled Abu Zeid, Regional Water Director, the Center of Environment and Development for the Arab region and Europe, CEDAR. Thank you very much for joining us. And dear viewers, now we move on to our next report. Cairo said there is a need to think collectively to achieve development and social justice in Africa. It said the continent is full of diverse natural resources shared by multiple countries. More in this report.
Cairo said that the 6th Cairo high-level meeting of the presidents of the Constitutional and Supreme Courts and the African Constitutional Councils is a continuation of efforts made in previous years to cooperate with African countries to achieve the continent's people's aspirations. Madbouli said the continent is full of diverse natural resources shared by multiple countries. He said Cairo is keen to preserve natural resources to ensure that future generations get their rights, which obliges the countries of Africa to work hard for the proper use of resources to achieve sustainable development and the well-being of African peoples. He said Cairo extends a helping hand and applies its human, scientific, and technical potential to promote the continent in various fields. He added that the chances forces African countries to think collectively to reduce the negative effects at the international level on the economies of African countries so that they may have a chance to succeed in achieving development and social justice.
Welcome back and still with our special reports. Africa's Disease Control Agency said COVID-19 is still a threat in the Black continent. It said it would continue to focus on getting as many people on the continent as possible fully vaccinated. More in this report.
The Africa Centers for Disease Control and Prevention Africa CDC said the COVID-19 pandemic is still a threat in Africa given the low vaccination rates. Speaking during a news conference, the acting head of CDC, Ahmed Ogwil Oma, said that just over 22% of Africa's population is fully vaccinated, which means the virus is still active on the continent. The acting director's comments appeared to contradict earlier comments by the head of the World Health Organization, Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus, that the end of the COVID pandemic was now in sight. The Africa CDC acting director added that his agency would continue focusing on getting as many people on the continent as possible fully vaccinated. African countries struggled to secure early supplies of COVID vaccines as rich nations hoarded doses, and more recently vaccine hesitancy and logistics problems have made it difficult to get shots into arms.
And well, dear viewers, that brings us to the end of this edition of Africa Today. Many thanks for watching and stay tuned for more coming up here on Nile TV International.